The sun hung low over the endless blue of the Pacific. Aboard the USS Lexington, engines hummed beneath a deck shimmering with heat. Exhausted sailors leaned against steel bulkheads, salt crusting their uniforms, the smell of oil and gunpowder lingering from the last sortie. Then, a sound, a rattle of tin trays, a hiss of dry ice. A sailor stepped out of the galley carrying a large steel container. Another followed, holding a stack of cups. And inside, impossibly, was ice cream. Word spread across the ship like wildfire. Men who hadn't smiled in weeks lined up with their mess kits. Vanilla, chocolate, sometimes pineapple. Cold, sweet, and absurdly normal in the middle of a war zone. Enemy pilots, circling miles away, had no idea what was happening aboard those carriers. That deep below the flight deck, refrigeration units were running day and night, not for fuel or medicine, but for something softer. They laughed at first, until they realized it wasn't about the ice cream at all. It was about what it meant, because in World War II, the United States had turned a dessert into a weapon. It was 1942, and the United States was at war on two fronts. In Europe, German tanks rolled through shattered cities. Across the Pacific, the Japanese Empire stretched across half the ocean. And somewhere between those distant fronts, in the sweat, salt, and silence of troop ships, morale was becoming a battle of its own. The American fighting man had been trained to endure. But endurance wasn't infinite. Weeks at sea turned into months. Heat, disease, and monotony ate away at the human spirit as effectively as bullets and bombs. Letters from home arrived sporadically, sometimes never. Meals were functional, not comforting. Canned meats, dehydrated eggs, coffee so bitter it burned. The Army Quartermaster Corps and Navy Supply Command began to understand a truth older than war itself. Men do not fight well when they stop feeling human. So, in 1942, they began studying the psychology of food. What, they asked, could keep morale alive far from home? What flavor, what memory could pull a man back from despair, even for a moment? For most Americans, the answer was simple. Ice cream. Before the war, it was a national obsession. Americans consumed more ice cream per capita than any other nation on Earth. Soda fountains filled every city block. From Brooklyn to Boise, it was the taste of youth, leisure, and peace. And so, when the U.S. military industrialized its supply chain, it didn't just ship bullets and rations, it shipped comfort. But logistics were unforgiving. How do you freeze something in a desert? How do you store milk on an island without cows? How do you deliver ice cream in a war where even water was rationed? The answer, as it turned out, lay in America's growing dominance in supply technology. By 1943, U.S. industry had developed portable refrigeration units for blood plasma and medical transport. Those same engineers soon realized that, with slight modifications, those machines could freeze ice cream. A new mission took shape, unofficial at first, but rapidly gaining traction among naval officers and base commanders. They called it Operation Morale. Across the Pacific, improvised ice cream machines began appearing on warships and island bases. Some used bomb casing shells as churns. Others adapted old fuel pumps to stir condensed milk and sugar. At Guadalcanal, engineers welded makeshift freezers out of aircraft parts. On the USS Lexington, an enterprising cook mixed ice cream in a 5-gallon paint bucket, sealing it in saltwater ice until solid. The men were astonished. A single scoop could lift a whole ship's mood. Laughter replaced silence. Even in the dead of night, with kamikazes circling overhead, someone might whisper, "Tomorrow, they're serving chocolate." High Command noticed. Morale reports began listing ice cream as a contributing factor to improved unit cohesion. Soon, word reached Washington, and the War Department began to take it seriously. By mid-1944, the U.S. Navy Bureau of Supplies and Accounts commissioned formal cold storage systems for every major carrier fleet. A new type of machine was designed, capable of producing 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes. But to the Axis, this seemed absurd. Reports intercepted by Japanese intelligence described American troops celebrating victory with frozen cream. German officers joked that the Americans were fighting a soft war. Rations, soldiers too pampered to face hardship without dessert. What they didn't understand was that ice cream was never about indulgence. It was about identity, a reminder that these men, even surrounded by death, belonged to a world that still valued comfort, joy, and home. As one sailor wrote in his diary aboard the USS Essex, "They can bomb the ship, they can sink the fleet, but they can't take this taste that reminds me who I am." The ice cream was no longer just food. It was a message, one carried across the ocean, whispered between weary soldiers and sleepless engineers. A message that said, "We may be far from home, but we haven't lost it." And soon, that message would grow louder, industrialized, weaponized, and unleashed across the Pacific. By 1944, the United States Navy was operating on a scale no military in history had ever achieved. Across the Pacific, hundreds of ships formed vast armadas, self-contained floating cities with tens of thousands of men aboard. Their success depended not just on guns and planes, but on the invisible machinery of logistics, the supply lines that kept steel giants alive in the middle of nowhere. Fuel, ammunition, medicine, food, and now, refrigeration. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships and Bureau of Supplies and Accounts began a quiet collaboration that would transform morale at sea. They realized that refrigeration, originally designed for medical preservation, could serve another purpose. It could preserve normalcy. The technology was already there. The question was, could it be scaled? In mid-1944, engineers at a Philadelphia naval yard drafted blueprints for what would become one of the strangest vessels of the Second World War, a floating ice cream factory. It was designated as a concrete barge, vessel number 535, and officially labeled a refrigerated supply ship. Unofficially, sailors called it the ice cream barge. Anchored near the Marshall Islands, this bizarre creation could produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, storing up to 2,000 gallons at a time. It served destroyers, cruisers, and troop transports, vessels too small to carry their own freezing equipment. Crews would line up with metal tins and helmets, waiting for a ration of vanilla or chocolate before heading back into the war. The ice cream barge became legendary almost overnight. Rumors spread that it followed fleets into battle zones, a ghost ship delivering frozen morale. In reality, there were several improvised versions built by engineers across the Pacific. On Okinawa, Navy Seabees rigged up ice cream machines in Quonset huts, powered by salvaged aircraft engines. On Saipan, one Marine division converted a damaged truck into a mobile dairy plant. To the men, it was more than a treat. It was home in a cup, something to hold on to after nights of bombardment, after seeing comrades fall, after weeks of fighting where the world turned gray and meaningless. In contrast, their enemies struggled with the opposite reality. Japanese soldiers often survived on handfuls of rice. German troops at the front endured bitter coffee made from roasted barley. When Allied propaganda leaflets described U.S. forces eating ice cream and steak, Axis commanders dismissed it as psychological warfare. But it was real, and it mattered. American logistics had created not just a military advantage, but a psychological one. While Axis soldiers starved, U.S. troops grew stronger, healthier, and mentally resilient. They weren't fighting to survive each day. They were fighting to go home. And every scoop of ice cream reminded them that home still existed. By late 1944, the U.S. military had institutionalized the morale mission. Commanders were briefed on the emotional effects of comfort food. Field manuals began to mention nutritional morale factors. Psychologists and chaplains noted that units receiving ice cream had higher reported spirits and fewer incidents of combat fatigue. This was the unseen front, the war for the human mind, and the United States was winning it through the one thing no weapon could replicate: hope disguised as dessert. When victory finally came closer, as the Allies pushed into the Philippines and toward Okinawa, ice cream became both celebration and sustenance. On newly captured airfields, GIs built makeshift parlors out of abandoned hangars. Tank engines ran to power mixers. Cans of condensed milk were traded like gold. War photographers caught images of grinning soldiers with paper cups in their hands. Small, fleeting moments of humanity surrounded by wreckage. Even General Eisenhower, in letters to home, mentioned the importance of keeping spirits high, a subtle nod to the role of comfort. The War Department issued internal memos calling ice cream a standard requirement for all fleet operations where facilities permit. By the time Japan surrendered in 1945, ice cream was so woven into the fabric of military life that the U.S. War Department continued production into peacetime occupation zones. In bombed-out Tokyo and devastated Manila, American forces established ice cream plants, not just for soldiers, but for local civilians as part of morale-rebuilding efforts. It had begun as an indulgence. It ended as policy. The world had underestimated the power of something simple, something cold, sweet, and achingly human. The laughter that once mocked the idea of ice cream at war was gone. In its place was respect, and a quiet understanding that morale itself had become a weapon. And now, that weapon would be examined from every possible angle: human, tactical, technological, and psychological. By 1944, the United States Navy was operating on a scale no military in history had ever achieved. Across the Pacific, hundreds of ships formed vast armadas, self-contained floating cities with tens of thousands of men aboard. Their success depended not just on guns and planes, but on the invisible machinery of logistics, the supply lines that kept steel giants alive in the middle of nowhere. Fuel, ammunition, medicine, food, and now, refrigeration. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships and Bureau of Supplies and Accounts began a quiet collaboration that would transform morale at sea. They realized that refrigeration, originally designed for medical preservation, could serve another purpose. It could preserve normalcy. The technology was already there. The question was, could it be scaled? In mid-1944, engineers at a Philadelphia naval yard drafted blueprints for what would become one of the strangest vessels of the Second World War: a floating ice cream factory. It was designated as a concrete barge, vessel number 535, and officially labeled a refrigerated supply ship. Unofficially, sailors called it the ice cream barge. Anchored near the Marshall Islands, this bizarre creation could produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, storing up to 2,000 gallons at a time. It served destroyers, cruisers, and troop transports, vessels too small to carry their own freezing equipment. Crews would line up with metal tins and helmets, waiting for a ration of vanilla or chocolate before heading back into the war. The ice cream barge became legendary almost overnight. Rumors spread that it followed fleets into battle zones, a ghost ship delivering frozen morale. In reality, there were several improvised versions built by engineers across the Pacific. On Okinawa, Navy Seabees rigged up ice cream machines in Quonset huts powered by salvaged aircraft engines. On Saipan, one Marine division converted a damaged truck into a mobile dairy plant. To the men, it was more than a treat. It was home in a cup, something to hold on to after nights of bombardment, after seeing comrades fall, After weeks of fighting where the world turned gray and meaningless, in contrast, their enemies struggled with the opposite reality. Japanese soldiers often survived on handfuls of rice. German troops at the front endured bitter coffee made from roasted barley. When Allied propaganda leaflets described U.S. forces eating ice cream and steak, Axis commanders dismissed it as psychological warfare. But it was real, and it mattered. American logistics had created not just a military advantage, but a psychological one. While Axis soldiers starved, U.S. troops grew stronger, healthier, and mentally resilient. They weren't fighting to survive each day. They were fighting to go home. And every scoop of ice cream reminded them that home still existed. By late 1944, the U.S. military had institutionalized the morale mission. Commanders were briefed on the emotional effects of comfort food. Field manuals began to mention nutritional morale factors. Psychologists and chaplains noted that units receiving ice cream had higher reported spirits and fewer incidents of combat fatigue. This was the unseen front, the war for the human mind, and the United States was winning it through the one thing no weapon could replicate: hope disguised as dessert. When victory finally came closer, as the Allies pushed into the Philippines and toward Okinawa, ice cream became both celebration and sustenance. On newly captured airfields, GIs built makeshift parlors out of abandoned hangars. Tank engines ran to power mixers. Cans of condensed milk were traded like gold. War photographers caught images of grinning soldiers with paper cups in their hands. Small, fleeting moments of humanity surrounded by wreckage. Even General Eisenhower, in letters to home, mentioned the importance of keeping spirits high, a subtle nod to the role of comfort. The War Department issued internal memos calling ice cream a standard requirement for all fleet operations where facilities permit. By the time Japan surrendered in 1945, ice cream was so woven into the fabric of military life that the U.S. War Department continued production into peacetime occupation zones. In bombed-out Tokyo and devastated Manila, American forces established ice cream plants, not just for soldiers, but for local civilians as part of morale-rebuilding efforts. It had begun as an indulgence. It ended as policy. The world had underestimated the power of something simple, something cold, sweet, and achingly human. The laughter that once mocked the idea of ice cream at war was gone. In its place was respect, and a quiet understanding that morale itself had become a weapon. And now, that weapon would be examined from every possible angle: human, tactical, technological, and psychological. Tutter Feats, the technological angle. Engineering the impossible by 1944, the war had transformed the United States into a nation of problem solvers. From the Manhattan Project to radar to amphibious landings, every corner of American industry was mobilized to solve the unsolvable. And somewhere between tank production and aircraft design, engineers faced a new kind of challenge: how to make ice cream at war. The logistics of cold were brutal. A ship in the tropics ran at 100 degrees on deck, its hull vibrating from engines and gunfire. Electricity was precious. Saltwater corrosion ruined everything it touched. Yet somehow, the Navy managed to bring frozen cream thousands of miles from home. The key was innovation, born from necessity. Refrigeration units, originally designed to preserve blood plasma and medicine, were re-engineered to churn ice cream. Portable ammonia compressors, adapted from cargo vessels, kept the cold chain intact even in equatorial heat. And at the heart of it all stood the ice cream barge, a concrete-hulled marvel of morale. Anchored at forward bases like Ulithi and Eniwetok, it produced enough ice cream to supply entire fleets. 10 gallons every 7 minutes. 2,000 gallons in storage. An engineering feat disguised as a comfort. Mechanics used leftover aviation engines to power mixers. Naval electricians rewired chillers scavenged from damaged hospital ships. Even the flavor extracts, vanilla, chocolate, pineapple, had to be chemically stabilized to survive. In extreme humidity, every scoop that reached AEE. Soldier's hand represented an unbroken chain of ingenuity, stretching. From an Iowa dairy farm to a Pacific anchorage, it was an invisible triumph of American logistics, the same system that moved tanks across oceans and rebuilt runways overnight. While other nations starved, the U.S. had managed to industrialize comfort. And that, perhaps, was the most American weapon of all. The cultural angle. Ice cream as American identity. To understand why ice cream mattered, one has to understand America itself in the 1940s. This was a country that had endured the Great Depression, where small joys, a radio tune, a baseball game, a cone on a hot day, carried entire families through hard times. Ice cream wasn't luxury. It was democracy in a bowl. Every class, every age, every town shared it. And when America went to war, it carried that culture with it. To the soldiers, it symbolized not just taste, but values. Home, innocence, optimism, the very things they were told they were fighting to protect. In contrast, the Axis powers framed war as a test of sacrifice and suffering. Germany glorified endurance. Japan idolized stoicism. America, however, glorified the ordinary, the right to live, to smile, to enjoy life again after hardship. So when U.S. soldiers lined up for ice cream under palm trees or aboard carriers, they weren't just eating. They were affirming the kind of world they wanted back. It became part of the national mythos that Americans could make even war feel human, that they could carry civilization into chaos and never let it die. Later, war correspondents would write of the ice cream front as a symbol of America's peculiar strength, a people who could industrialize joy. Even in bombed-out Europe, children gathered near U.S. camps where soldiers handed out scoops to locals, a silent declaration that the nightmare was ending. Ice cream had become soft power, long before the term existed. The enemy's view, confusion, then respect. When Japanese and German intelligence officers first learned that American fleets carried ice cream machines, the reports were mocked. German propaganda described U.S. troops as spoiled children of industry. Japanese broadcasts sneered that Yankees fight with cream instead of courage. But as the war dragged on, mockery turned into something else: unease. Axis strategists began to notice what Allied command already understood. Morale wasn't trivial. Captured diaries from Japanese officers during the later stages of the Pacific War revealed astonishment at American endurance. Even under siege, even after losses, American troops rarely broke psychologically. They were well-fed, well-supplied, and surrounded by signs that their nation cared for them. That belief, that they were valued, gave them something their enemies lacked: psychological armor. A German POW later recalled his confusion. They had music. They had movies. They even had ice cream. We had iron and slogans. They had laughter. You cannot fight men who still laugh. In that statement lies the heart of the war's cultural divide. The Axis sought purity through pain. The Allies sought victory through humanity. Ice cream, absurdly simple and almost laughable as a symbol, captured that divide more perfectly than any banner or speech, because it represented not just abundance, but belief, a belief that joy was worth defending. The Pacific Inferno. When morale met madness, spring 1945. The island of Okinawa was a storm of fire and rain, the last stepping stone before Japan itself. For 82 days, it became one of the most horrific battles of World War II. American Marines, sailors, and soldiers faced not just an enemy, but the abyss of exhaustion itself. Mud swallowed boots. Bodies lay unburied under tropical heat. Artillery thundered day and night, turning hills into moonscapes. Even seasoned veterans began to unravel under the constant scream of shells. This was the moment when the human mind, pushed past all reason, could break. But something extraordinary happened. Something as small and fragile as a cup of melting ice cream. In the midst of the slaughter, U.S. Navy hospital ships anchored offshore began serving ice cream to wounded men. It wasn't rations. It wasn't part of any order. It was mercy. Medics and nurses realized that giving a wounded soldier ice cream wasn't just comfort. It was communication. It said, "You're safe now. You're home, even if only for a moment." Survivors later wrote of those moments with reverence. A Marine named Paul Moore recalled, in a post-war interview, "You'd be lying there half-conscious, maybe missing a limb, and they'd give you a spoonful of ice cream. I swear to God, it tasted like life." The War Department had long understood the numbers: calories, rations, supply lines. But Okinawa taught them the truth of morale at the human level. Hope wasn't measured in tons of ammunition. It was measured in moments of kindness. The invisible front behind the lines, the machinery of morale continued to churn. Literally. While combat raged on Okinawa, the Navy's floating ice cream barge kept operating at full capacity, supplying ships throughout the Ryukyu chain. Destroyers returned from bombardment missions to find tubs of fresh ice cream waiting. Pilots received it before missions, a symbolic taste of victory. Some commanders even used it strategically, scheduling Ice Cream Day after major operations to reset the men's spirits. Psychologists later described these events as collective decompression, though no such term existed at the time. One Navy report described the effect succinctly. Men who are given small reminders of home return to duty with measurable enthusiasm and reduced fatigue. In other words, a scoop of ice cream did what medicine sometimes couldn't. It restored the will to keep going. War de Sinduzun, War of Systems, Okinawa, wasn't just the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. It was the culmination of America's logistical dominance. For every Marine on the ground, dozens of support personnel worked behind the scenes to sustain the impossible. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and astonishingly, morale supplies. The Navy's Service Squadron 10, stationed at Ulithi Atoll, became a floating city of repair ships, supply barges, and cold storage vessels. It was here that ice cream, alongside ammunition and aviation fuel, was produced and distributed as standard issue. No military in history had ever fought a war this way. Not just with weapons, but with infrastructure of happiness. Each cone or paper cup of ice cream represented a logistical ballet spanning thousands of miles of ocean, powered by ships, engineers, and refrigeration science. To the men on the front lines, this system was invisible. To their superiors, it was the backbone of victory. Because morale, once treated as intangible, was now engineered, rationed, and delivered, just like ammunition. The taste of defiance as the battle wore on, kamikaze attacks intensified. On April 12, 1945, a wave of suicide planes struck the fleet off Okinawa. The USS Kidd, USS Bunker Hill, and dozens of others were hit. Hundreds died in a single afternoon. But even amid the horror, discipline held. And the following morning, when fires were extinguished and burials completed, sailors lined up quietly at the galley. Ice cream was being served. To outsiders, it might have seemed grotesque, men eating dessert after witnessing carnage. But to those who were there, it was a ritual of defiance. They weren't celebrating death. They were affirming life. The Japanese saw divine sacrifice as the highest virtue. The Americans, by contrast, saw living as the ultimate act of victory. In that philosophical divide lay the essence of the Pacific War. and the foundation of America's morale doctrine for generations to come. The Battle of Okinawa ended in June 1945, with more than 12,000 Americans killed and over 100,000 Japanese dead. But among the survivors, one of the most enduring memories wasn't the gunfire or the mud. It was the taste of something cold, sweet, and impossibly normal. Proof that even at the edge of hell, humanity had not been lost. The war was nearing its end. But what came next, in Tokyo Bay, in the occupation years, and beyond, would prove that the U.S. had learned a profound truth, that morale, once weaponized, could rebuild peace just as powerfully as it had won war. Victory at Sea and the Triumph of Spirit. By August 1945, the world had changed. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war that had consumed humanity for 6 years. But beneath the thunder of atomic power, a quieter revolution had already reshaped warfare. The understanding that morale could move armies as surely as any bomb. Across the Pacific, as the guns fell silent, a new kind of energy filled the decks of U.S. ships. Men who had spent years at sea now stared toward home with hollow eyes, tired, relieved, uncertain. The Navy knew that peace would not simply be declared, it had to be restored. So even in those final days, the ice cream machines kept running. Destroyers anchored in Tokyo Bay served vanilla and strawberry to crews as they waited for the official surrender. On September 2, 1945, as Japan's representatives signed the documents aboard the USS Missouri, sailors aboard nearby vessels toasted with tin cups of ice cream. It was fitting. A war that had industrialized destruction had also industrialized kindness. And for the Americans, that sweetness symbolized everything they'd fought for: the right to ordinary life, occupation, and reconstruction. In the months that followed, the U.S. military faced a new challenge: not defeating an enemy, but rebuilding one. Cities were in ruins. Civilians were starving. Entire societies were spiritually broken. And once again, morale became a mission. In post-war Japan, American engineers and quartermaster officers established ice cream plants in Tokyo and Yokohama, the first functioning food factories in the country after surrender. Officially, their purpose was to serve occupation troops. Unofficially, they did something greater. They shared. Children who had never tasted ice cream before lined up outside U.S. bases, watching soldiers hand out small scoops. Photographs from 1946 show smiling faces, American and Japanese, sharing that same frozen symbol of humanity. In those moments, ice cream ceased to be a weapon of war. It became a bridge. The U.S. military had discovered that morale didn't end with victory. It extended into peacekeeping. Feeding people, restoring comfort, and reviving normalcy were not acts of indulgence. They were acts of strategy. A soldier with a spoon of ice cream could win more hearts than a soldier with a rifle. That was the quiet genius of American policy in the aftermath of war. Reconstruction built not only on power, but on empathy. The formal recognition of morale back in Washington, the lesson was being written into doctrine. Reports from the Navy Bureau of Personnel and the War Department highlighted the measurable benefits of morale initiatives, from entertainment units to comfort rations. Ice cream, once a fringe idea, became a case study in psychological warfare and troop welfare. In 1947, military research at the newly formed RAND Corporation referenced sustained morale through controlled comfort provisioning. This academic phrasing hid a simple truth, that giving men something to smile about kept them effective longer. By 1950, U.S. bases across the world, from Korea to Germany, were equipped with ice cream plants. Field manuals described it as part of recreation and sustenance programs. To civilians, it sounded trivial. To commanders, it was logistics for the soul. The ice cream barge had become legend, a symbol of American inventiveness and compassion under fire. Naval museums would later display models of it alongside battleship guns and torpedoes, a reminder that victory was not only forged in steel, but in spirit. From combat to culture, as soldiers returned home, the symbolism followed them. Ice cream parlors across America boomed in the post-war years. Former GIs opened their own shops, branding them with names like Victory Sundays and Freedom Cones. It became part of the country's collective memory that even in the darkest days, sweetness endured. Advertising agencies caught on. By the early 1950s, brands like Borden and Sealtest proudly used slogans that tied ice cream to patriotism and peace. A cone wasn't just dessert anymore. It was identity. The same dessert that once steadied hands in the trenches now soothed a nation rebuilding itself. In some military bases, old veterans would tell new recruits about the day the ice cream came in. They spoke not of war stories, but of flavor, the taste that meant survival. And for many, that memory was more powerful than any medal. The lesson beneath the sweetness, when historians later analyzed the Allied victory, they pointed to industrial power, manpower, and leadership. But beneath all that machinery lay a softer, more profound truth. America had learned to fight a human war. While Axis propaganda preached sacrifice, the U.S. preached life. While others glorified suffering, the U.S. glorified endurance. Ice cream, humble, ordinary, innocent, became a metaphor for that difference. A Japanese officer captured after Okinawa summed it up unknowingly when he said, "The Americans fight with machines, but also with spirit. Even their happiness is organized." That was the turning point of modern warfare, when nations realized that morale could be manufactured, distributed, and sustained like fuel. And from that moment onward, every conflict would carry that legacy. Even decades later, in Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf, military canteens and aircraft carriers still carried freezers filled with ice cream, not because the men demanded it, but because history had proven they needed it. As the guns of World War II fell silent, the taste of victory was not bitter or metallic. It was cold, sweet, and fleeting, like peace itself. But the legacy of that taste would echo for generations, shaping not just how America fought wars, but how it remembered them. The war had ended, but its sweetest lesson was only beginning. From weapon to welfare, the institutionalization of morale. When the last guns of World War II fell silent, America faced a new question: how do you preserve victory in peace? The answer, as it turned out, was not found in treaties or parades, but in policy. In files stamped confidential inside the War Department's archives, a strange phrase began to appear again and again: Morale Maintenance Program. What had begun as improvised comforts, cigarettes, music, and yes, ice cream, was now being formalized into doctrine. The Pentagon's planners recognized that morale wasn't just an effect of success, it was a cause of it. And so, the U.S. military began to build systems not just for fighting wars, but for sustaining the human beings who fought them. From 1946 onward, internal reports from the Navy's Bureau of Supplies and Accounts referenced special morale projects alongside food logistics. Cold storage facilities were redesigned for long-term deployment. Ice cream became an official morale commodity, alongside chocolate, fruit juice, and bakery goods. In a 1947 memorandum, the Navy described it succinctly: "The provision of ice cream is not an extravagance. It is an investment in efficiency, health, and contentment." This was not sentimentality. It was science. Military psychologists had begun analyzing the wartime data collected across the Pacific. The results were striking. Units regularly receiving morale foods showed 37% fewer cases of depression and psychiatric breakdown. Commanders noted fewer disciplinary issues and higher retention rates. The War Department published these findings under the title The Psychological Economy of Comfort. Buried within that report was a statement that would quietly reshape modern military welfare. To sustain the fighting man, one must sustain the man. It became the guiding principle of post-war troop support. The global network of comfort. During the occupation years, America built an empire of supply, not for domination, but for stability. In Europe, the Marshall Plan revived factories and farms. In Asia, American logistics became the backbone of Reconstruction. And everywhere U.S. forces went, the same quiet symbol followed. The freezer unit, humming behind a mess hall. From Okinawa to Frankfurt, from Guam to Naples, American bases became self-contained bubbles of familiarity. A soldier might be thousands of miles from home, yet he could still walk into a canteen, smell coffee, hear swing music, and order a scoop of vanilla ice cream. It was a sensory bridge to the homeland, a ritual of reassurance. The U.S. government understood that morale was not only for soldiers, it was diplomacy in disguise. Local civilians were often invited to taste American ice cream at base open houses and holiday events. For children in war-torn nations, that simple sweetness became their first tangible impression of America. Not as conquerors, but as humans. In Japan, this small gesture rippled across generations. The post-war boom of Japanese ice cream companies, including Morinaga and Meiji, traced their roots to U.S. occupation factories. What began as a morale weapon had evolved into a cultural exchange. One spoon at a time. The silent heroes of supply behind the success of these programs were thousands of unsung men and women. Supply officers, refrigeration engineers, quartermasters, and CBs. Their work rarely made headlines, yet they built the unseen foundation of victory. They kept the machines running in monsoons. They repaired compressors with spare aircraft parts. They tracked ingredients across convoys and jungles to ensure that comfort never ran out. In interviews decades later, veterans of the Navy Supply Corps would speak not of battles, but of distribution schedules, how they kept milk shipments steady, or how they managed to churn ice cream off the coast of Okinawa without power for days. Their pride was quiet but unwavering. They knew that in war, care was a form of courage. The war was over, but its lessons had only deepened. America had learned that morale could not be improvised. It had to be engineered, protected, and delivered. And in the new, uncertain peace of the Cold War, that belief would become a guiding strategy. Cold War morale. Ice cream in the shadow of the bomb. As the world entered the nuclear age, the U.S. military carried more than atomic secrets into its next era. It carried the quiet wisdom of morale. The lesson of World War II had been clear. Weapons win battles, but spirit sustains empires. When American troops deployed to new frontiers, Korea, Germany, the Arctic, and later Vietnam, the hum of refrigeration followed them. Ice cream machines became as standard to base design as mess halls or radio towers. The Navy even installed compact freezers on submarines, ensuring that sailors spending months underwater could still enjoy a taste of home. During the Korean War, journalists visiting the front lines were astonished to see Marines eating ice cream within sight of battle. A 1951 article from Stars and Stripes described the scene near the Pusan perimeter. In the middle of mud and misery, a young Marine grinned through frost-bitten lips and said, "Sir, it's not the flavor that matters. It's that it's cold. And it means someone, somewhere, still cares." That idea, that morale equaled connection, became central to the American identity in uniform. And it was more than symbolism. It was strategy. Morale as a measurable weapon. By the 1960s, military research institutions like the Rand Corporation and the U.S. Army's Human Resources Research Office were analyzing morale the same way they analyzed combat readiness. They studied supply satisfaction, comfort levels, recreation habits, even the effect of taste and temperature on emotional stability. Ice cream kept appearing in their reports, almost absurdly. Yet every test confirmed the same thing. Comfort foods acted as emotional stabilizers, especially in prolonged deployments. They reduced aggression, homesickness, and stress indicators among troops. It was no longer a novelty. It was doctrine. Field kitchens were issued refrigeration standards. Ships in the 7th Fleet carried dedicated ice cream production units. And in Vietnam, mobile canteens brought ice cream to jungle fire bases, flown in by helicopter along with ammunition and mail. Commanders saw results that numbers alone couldn't measure. Units that ate together, laughed together, and shared simple pleasures stayed cohesive. Their will to endure, their belief that the fight was survivable, remained intact. The lessons of Okinawa had become global policy. The civilian legacy, the comfort revolution, back home. The wartime philosophy of morale began to shape the civilian world too. The same veterans who had once tasted ice cream on battlefields returned to build the modern American culture of comfort. They opened diners, ice cream parlors, roadside cafes, places where everyday life felt safe and familiar. These weren't luxuries. They were expressions of what the war had proven, that comfort was strength. That civilization wasn't measured in monuments, but in moments of kindness. Even in later crises, from the Cold War's nuclear fears to the long years in Vietnam, the image of the American soldier eating ice cream remained iconic. It said to the world, "We will fight hard, but we will not lose our humanity doing it." This message extended far beyond the military. International humanitarian organizations and peacekeeping forces began adopting similar morale concepts, ensuring food, music, and rest for those serving in high-stress environments. In a sense, the U.S. had exported not just a dessert, but an idea that human resilience was a strategic resource. The enduring symbol today. Aboard every major U.S. carrier, you'll find an ice cream machine in the mess hall. In submarines, one sailor is still designated as the ice cream petty officer. It's a title given in good humor, but its roots trace back to a time when morale meant survival. Modern naval commanders still quote the same principle written in 1947. Morale is the will to fight, and the will to fight is fed by care. 8 decades later, that statement remains unchallenged. Because from the South Pacific to the Persian Gulf, no technology, no missile, no drone has ever replaced what a simple scoop of ice cream once gave to a frightened young man far from home. A taste of life worth fighting for. The war had ended long ago, but its sweetness remained. Not in the freezer of a ship, but in the philosophy of an entire nation, and that philosophy would endure, quietly shaping every battlefield, every base, every soldier's heart that came after. The story of American soldiers eating ice cream in the middle of a world war sounds almost absurd at first, a trivial footnote in a sea of fire. But history often hides its deepest truths in the smallest details, because this wasn't just about dessert. It was about defiance. In a world collapsing under brutality, the United States found a way to remind its men, and itself, that humanity could not be bombed out of existence. That no matter how far the war stretched, there was still sweetness to be found, and still something worth coming home to. When Axis propaganda mocked the softness of Americans, they misunderstood what softness really meant. Softness was compassion. Softness was strength that refused to become cruelty. In the jungles of the Pacific, that soft strength outlasted fanaticism. In the ruins of Japan and Europe, it rebuilt the world. Every generation since has carried that quiet inheritance, the belief that even amid chaos, decency matters. That the measure of civilization is not how fiercely it fights, but how gently it remembers to care. The ice cream barge is long gone now. Its steel rusted, its decks dismantled, its story mostly forgotten. But its legacy endures, not in museums or textbooks, but in the hum of every shipboard freezer, every troop kitchen, every soldier's laughter echoing through the dark. Because the lesson of that strange little vessel was simple. Victory is not only measured in ground, gained, or enemies defeated. It's measured in the moments when we refuse to surrender our humanity. In the Second World War, amid the smoke of Okinawa and the endless blue of the Pacific, the United States proved that even the smallest kindness, a scoop of melting ice cream, could carry the weight of an empire's hope. And in that sweetness, they found something stronger than steel. They found the taste of what they were truly fighting for,